Welcome back to the Bite Pod, where we explore the human side of trade compliance and the tools that help make it simpler, smarter, and stronger. I'm your host, Anne Riitho, and today we're talking about something every exporter deals with, but not everyone fully understands. And these are things that shouldn't be surprising in export compliance. Our guest today is someone who's built her career helping companies take the mystery out of the U.S. export system, from ownership screening to anti-boycott rules and the realities of working with military end users. She believes compliance doesn't have to be intimidating, it just has to be understood. So let's get into the rules that shouldn't be surprising with someone who knows how to make them make sense. Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
Sarah is the founder and president of S. Massie Consulting, a firm that helps businesses navigate U.S. export regulations with clarity and confidence. She brings to us over 20 years of experience in export compliance, international trade strategy, and training. She has served as the Senior International Trade Specialist for the Idaho Department of Commerce, where she led global trade missions and helped companies expand into new markets. What makes Sarah stand out is her ability to turn complex export regulations into practical, engaging guidance. She has a gift for taking what often feels very overwhelming and making it understandable and enjoyable. So I'm excited to talk more. Sarah, you've built your reputation for helping exporters cut through the noise, making compliance less about panic and more about practical, everyday understanding. Before we dive into our topic, can you tell us a little bit more about how you ended up in export consulting and what brought you into this space and what types of companies you're helping today?
Sure. Honestly, I launched into international business pretty much shortly after high school when I spent a year abroad. I studied at the Universidad Tecnológica in Panama, and I came back just excited for the international world. And I thought to myself, what can I do? Oh, maybe I'll be an ambassador. Then I realized I kind of didn't want to go into politics, and so I found business. And once I landed on international business, I put the two together, and I even started by the time I started college, I knew what I wanted to do. And I worked for a small company out of college and right away saw export compliance gaps. And so I helped them get started with that because I remember asking them, hey, what are you doing for screenings? And they kind of gave me that deer in the headlights look and said, what screenings? And so I knew right from the get-go, there are companies out there that are exporting and they have gaps. And so I helped that company with international sales. I helped them get started with some issues with compliance as well as issues with customs. And then I went from there on to the Idaho Department of Commerce, and where I worked with a lot of different companies all the way across the state, with focuses mainly in manufacturing, aerospace, technology, medical equipment, and like the safety and security sectors. Mm-hmm. And time again, I saw the struggles that they had with export compliance. Not just they didn't know what they didn't know, but also once they finally realized that there were things they didn't know what to do. They didn't know where to go. There's a plethora of information on the web, but it can also become very overwhelming. And so it was when I decided to launch my own business that I dove headfirst into the Export Administration Regulations, the EAR, and the International Traffic in Arms Regulations for the ITAR. And my focus has been on small to medium-sized companies because they are the ones that struggle the most. And I help them from a broad range of things, from the very first export all the way to, full written export compliance programs and training their companies on also, how to fill the gaps and to really help them to be able to work in the next generation of export compliance staff so that it's not just on one person's shoulders. Because if that one person wins the lottery and they're out the door, all that institutional knowledge goes with them. That's why it's so important to have these things written down. But yeah, so our services, like I said, we've got the full range. We have trainings that go all the way from the introduction to export compliance all the way up to ITAR empowered official trainings. And The companies that I tend to work with, not surprisingly, are similar to those that I worked with at Idaho Commerce. I work with manufacturers, particularly in the aerospace and safety and security industries, but also in arms and ammunition, and other things like that. But while those are the ones that tend to navigate towards me because they understand they need export compliance more than others might, honestly, any type of commodity is where I can assist.
That's so interesting. And I feel like your background is such a great example of what people are now recognizing trade compliance to be, which is a commerce enablement. And I feel like so often people see trade compliance as like a barrier or something we have to do and it slows things down. But I love that you came at it and you're just encouraging that like international business and building in systems that help enable the commerce and the global economy in that way.
No, and absolutely. One of the things I tell people is I help them to say yes more often because they know when they have to say no, but they also know when they can say yes because there's exceptions out there, there's exemptions, there's specific nuances, and some of those we'll get into later. People get afraid of the military end user, for example, and we'll talk about that later, I think. But I help them to say yes more often to those international sales, and I help them say yes with confidence.
Awesome. And we've talked a lot before about, and you've said export compliance shouldn't be full of surprises, but yet so many teams feel blindsided when rules pop up. So, for example, a month ago, BIS, it was much rumored for a long time, but finally came out with the 50% ownership rule. We've also talked about how OFAC has a 50% ownership rule. Can you walk us through kind of all these changes and kind of what that looks like and why these are surprises to people?
Yes, of course. Yeah, that's a classic, shouldn't be surprising moments. And the OFAC 50% rule has actually been around for years. And it's based off of the specially designated nationals and blocked persons list. That's a mouthful. It's the SDN list for short. And it basically says that if a blocked person owns 50% or more of a company, directly or indirectly, that the company is also considered blocked. And so it kind of walks you down the line of, the top owner owns another company who owns another company who owns another company. And so even if those companies further down the line don't appear by name on that sanctions list, they are still blocked by this rule. And so it's not just about who's listed, but also about who owns the entity that you're doing business with. Because companies are so easy to create these days, like the government just can't keep up with it. Heck, when I created my company, it was just online and I filled out some paperwork, right? And so companies can do that all the time. And that unfortunately helps the bad guys kind of conceal that they're the bad guys. And so the government is just pushing that responsibility down to exporters because you're supposed to know who you're doing business with anyway. And so this new BIS affiliate rule mirrors the ownership screening of the companies that are owned directly or indirectly by 50% or more. And just like OFAC, except it's for the entity list and the military end user list. They also added a new red flag that says if you aren't able to determine that ownership percentage when there is a blocked person involved, if you can't determine if down the line that percentage is high enough to hit that threshold, then you either need to apply for a license or you can use a license exception if there happens to be one that's available. You just have to document it. And what's funny, or maybe frustrating, is that the OFAC rule isn't new, but many exporters just learned about it because the BIS announced its affiliate rule. And like I said, it mirrors that same ownership structure. So the BIS wasn't trying to create a new burden. It was actually just sharing the same type of structure that OFAC did. And I was pleased that they did that. Unfortunately, what it's done is shine a spotlight on what's kind of been sitting quietly in the OFAC world for years.
And why do you think there's a gap there? Why do you think what exporters should know and what they actually know is lacking?
Well, I think that there's several factors that play into gaps like this. First, many businesses, they're just working hard to grow their business. And there's also not a one-stop shop for all the regulations. And so they usually have to piece it together from different sources. And honestly, that's tough. Like I said, there's a plethora of information out there, but too much can also be too much. And so fighting through the noise, right, that's where I come in and help you with that. But for export compliance, many times I think that many small companies, honestly, I think a lot of them just wing it. Many times they're just doing what the freight forwarder asks them for, not realizing that there's depth beyond that they're also needing to apply for or deal with, licensing in particular and how you determine that license or if you need one, these ownership screenings, and also technical data controls. Those tend to be things that I see top the list of regulations that are either unknown or misunderstood. For many companies, they also just focus on the EAR or the ITAR, and poor OFAC, that's your Office of Foreign Assets Control. They don't get the spotlight like the EAR and the ITAR do. Plus, let's be honest, export regulations are complicated. So unless someone's really digging in, things just fall through the cracks. And that's exactly why I started S. Massie Consulting in the first place, was to really help fill those gaps and to help the companies learn to navigate this world of export compliance.
Yeah, and I think to your point, the world of export compliance, and again, most recently, this 50% rule, all of this is really intimidating for people. It sounds complicated. The 50% rule, like you said, it mirrors OFAC, but it really shook the community. At the end of the day, it's, as you said, it's understanding who you're doing business with. So, how do you think exporters can approach ownership screening without getting lost in the details or feeling like what's happening is an impossible ask upon them?
Yeah, it's a good point, and it definitely sounds intimidating, but it's really just about knowing your customer and doing due diligence and doing a good job of it. Now, the government's not going to expect you to break your neck and find every single tiny itty bitty detail just because it is complicated, and companies do sometimes go to great lengths to hide their ownership structure. But the goal is for you to do your best and to try and to document it. Honestly, this makes me think of like the Wizard of Oz, and a company might be trying to tell you, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. But it's important that we know who's behind the curtain. And so that's this ownership screening, right? It's just another part of your due diligence. So there's several things that I tell my clients. First, try not to overthink it. Start with what you have. You have company names, you have contact names, you have addresses. Screen those just like you normally would. You can also ask your client or potential client for their ownership structure. If they're not trying to hide anything, they're going to give it to you. If they know that there's at least some of the ownership structure that they can reveal to you without getting in trouble, they might do that as well. And it gives you a good place to start. And so then beyond that, you can do more digging and more searching. And of course, there are resources out there that you can pay for. There's companies that have already done this research for you. There's a family tree and all those kinds of things. But I know, again, most of my clients, they're not paying for those types of resources. And so there's a few things that I mentioned that companies can do. You can check company disclosures if it's a publicly traded company. You can check corporate registries, like where they might be required to register to operate their business. You can also use resources like there's an offshore leaks database out there, and even Wikipedia. I mean, a lot of these things are built for other people by other people. And so why not use somebody else's knowledge if you can? You can also even just Google the company name with terms like parent company, subsidiary, ownership to see what pops up, see if there's been anything in the news lately or things like that. And then we also suggest if you've got a VPN to use it to put yourself in that potential client's home country, because a lot of times they will market to their own market very differently than how they're going to market themselves to the US. And so you might find out a lot more information by going to their homepage website, using Google Translate to translate it to English if you need to, and reading what they say. And then also some of the tips, once you do find some ownership structure, the next step is to screen that ownership structure. I obviously don't worry about the percentages unless you find someone who's on the list. Because if nobody on your ownership structure pops up on any of these lists, you don't need to know if it's 50% or more. It doesn't have any weight into what you're doing. So don't make it harder on yourself by worrying about percentages in the beginning. Just wait until you find someone that pops up on one of those lists. And of course, document.
I was going to say, keep it simple, do your screening, and document.
Yep.
Sounds like a simple process. And we don't typically plug BITE on here, but I'll just mention, BITE is one of those tools that you mentioned that people can pay for, but we definitely try to keep clients like yours in mind, the small and medium businesses that can't pay a ton of money to get that information in there. And I'll also say, you mentioned that the Leaks website. There are also other websites that you can go on, like Open Corporates is a free website. You can just search on there and see what pops up, and it aggregates a lot of other data sets. So there are definitely affordable resources out there. And then you just have to make sure you're documenting it, right? Like the Google is great, but you have to then be able to make sure that that's saved somewhere and that you have proof of that.
Yes. Yeah. Document, what did you search for? What did you find or what didn't you find? And, when you did this, and keep that, because honestly, if the BIS or OFAC come knocking at your door, you can show them that you tried and you gave it a really good try to document and find that ownership structure so that if something slipped through the cracks, you got yourself covered on that end.
Another area that trips up a lot of exporters is the anti-boycott screening. Not, again, because it's new, but because most people think that screening that list is the whole picture, or if they see a flag on that list, they don't know what that means or what that's about. So what should companies be screening for anti-boycott beyond the list itself, and what do they need to know about that?
Right. Well, first is I find that many companies are not even familiar with the anti-boycott screening requirements in the first place. Effectively, it's the U.S. government saying that U.S. companies are not allowed to participate in boycotts that are not sanctioned by the U.S. government. And that's the gist of it. And the requester list that you're mentioning is actually a new thing for the anti-boycott screenings. And so this isn't the end all be all, as you've said. It's a list of companies that have been reported to have made these anti-boycott requests of U.S. companies. That doesn't mean you can't sell to them. It doesn't mean that they're bad companies. It just means that they're participating in boycotts that we're not allowed to participate in. And so the key for this is actually, that list brings awareness that the client you're working with, if they're on that list, might be one more inclined to make such a request. But regardless of whether the company's on that list or not, you still have to pay attention to things in requests for quotes, in terms and conditions, and even just emails. For example, a company trying to ask you for the nationalities of your board members, like that's a red flag. Or if they state things like the quotation should not include items manufactured by firms who are under an Israeli boycott list. And also, just because you don't actually have anything that you manufacture that's by a firm on that list, so just because you sort of inadvertently don't have that doesn't mean that you can ignore it, because you're not allowed to have that information in quotes that you sign or things that you agree to. You have to have it removed from any contracts that you're working with, and you also need to report it. And so these are just to help the government stay on top of what companies are participating in these things. And you don't want to accidentally get caught in a violation by just not reading through all the T's and C's properly, or ignoring things where you say, that doesn't even apply to us, because we're not in that same boat.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So read your terms and conditions, know what you're signing. Again, going back to understanding not only your customer, but what the relationship looks like.
Yes.
And it's similar, I think, with military end users. So there's this misconception that military means prohibited. Can you help us kind of understand what that means? What does military end user actually mean in the context of this compliance conversation?
Yeah, that's right. And when it comes to misconceptions about military end users, this happens under both ITAR and the EAR. And so I'm constantly telling companies a couple of things. One is on the ITAR side, the military in general buys a lot of things, including water bottles and clothes. And so just because the military wants to buy your product, it doesn't make it ITAR controlled. So it doesn't change your product classification just because the military wants to buy it. That usually comes into play with technologies. Now, if the government is asking you to change something in your technology to fit theirs, that's a whole different story. We're not going to get into on this little bit here. Now, on the EAR side, that's where you end up with some military end uses and military end users that are prohibited. But the EAR is actually very specific. And it's in part 744.21. If somebody wants to go look that up, that's where it is. They actually define what is a military end use, what is a military end user. I'm not going to read it because it's a slightly boring definition, but they define it. And so if the company you're working with doesn't fit that definition, then it doesn't fit the definition. And so you don't have to think about this in the first place. Now, beyond that, there's actually a specific list. So they give a couple of different focuses, but there's a list of products that are not to be exported to specific countries, such as Burma, Cambodia, the People's Republic of China, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Those are all mentioned specifically. Mm-hmm. So if you're not on that list of products, you don't have to worry about it. And if you are on that list of products, if your product is on that list of products, then you have to decide, am I shipping to one of these countries? And that's when this starts to come into play. And so there's also, and then as far as the military end user list, that is for military end users that are outside of the countries that I just mentioned. And so the military end user list is something that can be searched. But again, it's specific products to specific countries for specific uses. And of course, Russia and Belarus have their own whole specific regulations that I'm not going to get into that fall into this type of thing as well. But the point is that you need to read the regulations to understand the specific limitations of this. Don't think that it's for all military everywhere and all products apply to it.
You're very good at what we said at the beginning, simplifying this for people. It doesn't have to be intimidating. There are still ways that you can do international business. You just Absolutely. Have to know the rules. So for those listeners who want to get smarter about this, where should they start? Are there tools, checklists, resources that you typically point clients to without giving away all the magic?
Honestly, there's a lot of best practices for export compliance that the government expects exporters to comply with. And some of those aren't spelled out in the regulations. And so you don't have to read every regulation to be able to get some of these good tools and tips and tricks. Honestly, the best resources are straight from the BIS for the EAR and straight from the DDTC for the ITAR. They have export compliance program guidelines and ITAR compliance program guidelines. And they walk through 8 key different elements that you should be focusing on. And in particular, each of those has its own self-audit section. And in that, it demonstrates the depth of the things that exporters are expected to have. And so it's, I think, really eye-opening to go through that list to find out what are you currently doing that's on those lists? What are you not doing that's on those lists? What are you not even aware of? Like, open up the gaps to help you to find those things. And so that's the main thing I point people to, is to find out what you're missing.
Super helpful. We'll make sure to link those self-auditing tools in the recording of this. I think that is a great place for people to start and kind of just do a little bit of self-reflection in terms of where are you and where do you need to go. If you could leave exporters with one piece of advice, one thing that people are still finding surprising but shouldn't be, what would it be?
There's actually 2 things that come to mind here. The first one is that the government expects you as an exporter to train all of your employees. Yes, all of them, not just the ones handling the exports, not just the one person who handles your exports, maybe even, but all employees, because they really want everyone to understand export compliance in general. What is it? Why does it exist? And then what does that mean to them? What does that mean to that person? Because everybody ties into it, especially when you have products that have some technology behind them that are controlled, because you need to be able to control that data domestically as well as internationally. And so, yes, training all employees is one thing that shouldn't be surprising, but tends to be. And then the second one is that the government also expects you to have a written export compliance manual. And that's in those guidelines. They give you a bunch of things that you should have in your program, but the last key element is that actual physical written manual. And I've been on trainings before where a BIS gentleman and a DDTC gentleman both said when they knock on someone's door, the first thing that they ask is, where is your export compliance program? Like, they want to see it. And they want to know that you're working it. And so my advice is to get your export compliance manual written and train all your employees so that everyone understands, like I said, what is it, why does it exist, and then what does that mean? What are the steps to make sure that you're staying compliant? And if you are not able to do that in-house, that's when you hire a consultant, such as myself, who can do it for you. And you find those outside resources, because we understand that small companies just can't quite do it all themselves. And, bites the same way. Sometimes you just don't want to do it all yourself. And so you bring in these outside resources to help. So that's my advice.
Yeah, and that's super interesting that people say, hand me the program, have it printed, right? Like, have it ready and available. Also on the training side, going back to something we said earlier about due diligence, but documenting the training, right? Like, is it a certificate? Is it a date when everyone was last trained? Do you train people as part of your onboarding process? So keeping a record of all of that is always recommended as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, definitely document all of it, including what topics were covered, because I've come up to companies and said, have you guys had an export compliance training? And they said, oh yeah, we had one in an all hands on meeting. It was about 15 minutes. And I thought, that's not much information. You're not going to get a lot of information in a 15-minute meeting. And so having the topics that you've learned, I think, are also key, because the government's not going to see that 15-minute conversation as much training, unless you've got it backed up with, hey, here's the written stuff you need to go read now that we've talked about it. And then that's you're documenting that type of information as well.
Yeah, and what are your thoughts? I'm going a little bit off script here a little bit, but in terms of the training too, we've been working with some customers of ours around training topics and trying to make them specific to like different jobs within an organization, right? So what an international salesperson needs to know about export compliance is different than what the HR person needs to know or kind of understand how their role interacts with export compliance. Do you have any kind of recommendations for companies who are trying to think through processes like that?
Yeah, and so again, back to those guidelines, both the BIS and the DDTC tell you what are the basics. What are the basics that they expect everybody to understand? And then beyond that, having a tiered program is exactly what you're talking about. So what tier level do the salespeople need? What tier level does the engineers need versus the export compliance folks versus on the ITAR and the empowered official side? So who needs the most training? And so yes, small companies, many times they train everybody the same way because it's easier and more efficient. But yes, the export compliance people definitely need more training than anybody, honestly. And then sales need a lot of training because they're the ones that are hands-on with the clients. So they're the ones that are going to see the red flags first. They're the ones that are going to catch those anti-boycott things in emails versus your contract person maybe who will catch the T's and C's. And so different people need to be aware of different parts of their job. And so part of the written export compliance program is spelling those out. Who's responsible for what steps? And so making sure that each step is taken care of. Who's doing it? When are they doing it? How often do they do it? Where are they documenting it? Where is it being stored? How long do you store it for? Who's destroying it when the time comes? All of that information. Having that in a written program really, really helps. And so that it makes it really clear who needs the extra training and who doesn't.
That is super helpful, and I hope that many listeners reach out to you to help them kind of navigate this, because it does start to get a little bit more complicated. It starts to sound a little bit more intimidating than when we were laying it down before. But at the end of the day, like you've said, know what you're exporting, who you're exporting it to, and what that relationship looks like, right?
That's right, because everything can be controlled. Everything, even a water bottle, like I mentioned earlier, everything can be controlled based on where it's going, who it's going to, what they do, what they're going to use it for. All of those things come into play. And so that's why it's so important to know your customer, but it's also important to know your limitations. What are your limitations? So when do you have to say no? Or when do you need a license? And then at the same time, like I said, be able to say yes with confidence. And I had a company that I met one time that told me that they don't sell to companies in countries that their bank doesn't want to work with, because the bank is gun shy with that country in particular. But that can be very limiting because banks are very conservative. And so obviously getting paid is important, but there are other ways to get paid. There's different, resources and letters of credit and all sorts of things that you can work into it, insurance, to make that export safe to those countries where banks maybe don't want to say yes to. But it's important so that you can say yes with confidence, but also know your limitations, because again, everything can be controlled.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. This was such a great conversation. You've reminded us that compliance doesn't have to be fear-driven. You don't have to be reactive to these ever-changing regulations that pop up and keep us on our toes. And with the right mindset and the right processes, trade compliance programs can become a real strength. For listeners who want to learn more, you can find Sarah at smassieconsulting.com. It'll be linked in the description of this. Or I'm going to say connect on LinkedIn. That's where Sarah and I first met as well. And you can stay up to date on trainings and resources that she puts out. Any other final thoughts as we wrap up, Sarah?
I encourage people to continue exporting even when things seem complicated and a little bit nervy sometimes with changing situations. But the fact is there is huge opportunity internationally for products and international sales to grow your markets, to get beyond the U.S. borders, to bring in new opportunities, as well as to extend the life cycle of your product. Because even if the technology is becoming less important here in the U.S., that doesn't mean that other countries don't still want it and need it, and it's cutting edge there. So there's a huge opportunity outside the U.S. borders, and I definitely encourage companies to seek it out.
Thank you. And if you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow the Bite Pod wherever you listen and share it with someone on your team who could use a little more clarity in their compliance world. I'm Anne Riitho. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.